Chakshuha Sarvani Bhutani Samikshamahe. This ancient verse from the Rig Veda speaks of looking upon all beings with the eyes of a friend. It beautifully captures the very spirit of diplomacy and partnership, which is at heart of the international relations. In many ways, it mirrors the evolution of the Indo-US relationship, a relationship that has grown from skepticism and divergence to cooperation and convergence. Greetings of the day, everyone. Today, I, Shahida Mushtaq, stand before you to present a comparative analysis of Indo US relations in the post Cold War era, specifically examining how leadership under Republican and Democratic administrations has influenced this dynamic. Through this analysis, I will attempt to answer a crucial question: which model of leadership aligns more closely with India's foreign policy interests? To guide you through this journey, we will take a chronological approach, starting from the end of the Cold War, moving through landmark moments in the bilateral relationship, and focusing on key themes that define the partnership, like defense, trade, geostrategy, and values. Let's begin in the year 1991, a year that marked a profound transformation in the global order with the collapse of the Soviet Union. This collapse altered the strategic environment in India and the United States operated. India, which had traditionally leaned towards the Soviet bloc and followed a policy of non alignment, found itself navigating a new unipolar world order dominated by the United States. Coincidentally, 1991 was also the year India opened up its economy under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. Liberalization marked India's integration into the global economy and opened a new pathways for engagement with the West, including the US. In Washington, President George H.W. Bush of the Republican Party was in office. However, it was during President Bill Clinton's Democratic administration that the early efforts at resetting ties between began in earnest. Clinton's historic visit to India in 2000 symbolized a thaw in relations after years of Cold War skepticism. Despite this, it wasn't until the early 2000s that the Indo US relationship truly accelerated. As we move forward into the 21st century, one thing becomes clear. Both Republicans and Democrats have recognized India's growing importance, yet they have approached India through different lenses. Democrats, broadly speaking, tend to prioritize value based diplomacy, often foregrounding human rights, environmental concerns, and labor rights. Republicans, in contrast, have traditionally been more pragmatic and transactional, focusing on hard power, trade liberalization, and defense cooperation. This divergence has shaped the tone and the content of bilateral engagements. To understand this better, let's anchor our discussion within three theoretical frameworks. The first is realism, a thought of a school of thought emphasizing power politics, military capability, and state sovereignty. Republican administrations have typically followed this path, aligning well with India's pursuit of strategic autonomy, a principle where India avoids binding alliance but builds strong partnership based on national interests. The second framework is liberal institutionalism, which focuses on rule based multilateralism, global governance, and democratic norms. This is more in line with democratic administrations, which have often emphasized India's role with global institutions like the United Nations or World Trade Organization. Lastly, strategic autonomy is itself a core principle of India's foreign policy. India's balancing act between East and West, always mindful of safeguarding its sovereignty. Interestingly, this aligns more naturally with the Republican preference for bilateralism or multilateralism. Now, let's dive into something specific, the themes where this divergence becomes more visible. First, defense and security cooperation. It was under Republican President George W. Bush that the Indo US civil nuclear deal was signed in 2005, a watershed moment that not only normalized India's nuclear status but also laid the groundwork for deeper defense ties. This pragmatic approach reflected the Republican willingness to sidestep bureaucratic hurdles in favor of realpolitik. In the years that followed, the US became one of India's largest defense supplier. The Trump administration, also Republican, furthered this momentum by signing key agreements like COMCSA, LEMOA, and BECA, facilitating interoperability and intelligence sharing. Democratic administrations, notably under Obama and Biden, have maintained these major agreements but have often hesitated to deepen them. For example, while President Obama declared India a major defense partner, there was less enthusiasm around technology transfer and intelligence sharing compared to his Republican counterparts. Furthermore, on the issue of counterterrorism, Republicans, particularly Trump, took a hard stance against Pakistan, which resonated strongly with Indian concerns. Trump's administration cut military aid to Pakistan and explicitly condemned cross border terrorism. In contrast, Democrats have tried to balance relations between India and Pakistan, sometimes leading to frustration in New Delhi. Shifting now to the economic sphere, Republican administrations have traditionally supported free trade and deregulation. President Bush was instrumental in fostering India's IT boom and promoting FDI to India. Trump, while protectionist in rhetoric, still sought bilateral trade and energy deals with India, focusing on reducing India's trade deficit with the US. Democrats, while supportive of trade, have often linked economic cooperation to broader labor and environmental standards. For instance, under President Biden, concerns around labor rights and carbon emission have become focal points in trade discussions. While well intentioned, these stipulations sometimes create barriers for Indian exporters, especially in sectors like textiles and agriculture. The next theme is geostrategic interests, particularly regarding China. Both parties recognize the importance of countering China's rise, but their methods differ. Trump's Republican administration was more direct and forceful, championing a free and open Indo Pacific, strengthening the Quad, and bolstering India's capacity to counterbalance Beijing's assertiveness. Democrats like Obama and Biden have favored more caution approach. Obama's pivot to Asia strategy laid the groundwork but lacked robust follow through on the military front. Biden revived Quad summits but continues to emphasize diplomacy over deterrence, aligning with the democratic tradition of multilateralism. The divergence is also evident when it comes to human rights and democratic values. Republicans have historically refrained from commenting on India's internal matters. Trump, for example, avoided criticism on sensitive issues like Kashmir or the Citizenship Amendment Act. This aligns with India's long standing demand for non interference in its domestic affairs. On the other hand, Democratic administrations from Clinton to Obama to Biden have voiced concern about civil liberties, religious freedoms, and press freedom in India. While these are valid normative concerns, New Delhi has often perceived them as a diplomatic irritants that complicate bilateral ties. Finally, on climate and multilateral cooperation, Democrats, particularly under Obama and Biden, have pushed for stronger climate action and deeper engagement in international forums like the Paris Climate Accord and the G20. Republicans, especially Trump, withdrew from the Paris Accord, instead favoring bilateral energy deals with India that focused on liquefied natural gas exports and defense related technologies. So the question is, where does this leave us? When we look at the evidence, it becomes apparent that Republican leadership often aligns more closely with India's foreign policy objectives, particularly in terms of strategic autonomy, pragmatic diplomacy, and economic liberalization. Republicans have often offered India more space to chart its own course without imposing normative conditions. Their hard nosed approach to defense, trade, and geopolitics resonate with India's desire for a multi aligned but sovereign foreign policy. As we look to the future, the possibilities of Donald Trump's return in 2025 could further enhance this alignment. We might expect a renewed focus on bilateral defense cooperation. Secondly, deregulation in trade negotiations. Thirdly, and a tougher US stance on China and Pakistan, developments that India would likely welcome. In conclusion, while India values its bipartisan ties with United States, it has found that Republican administrations tend to offer more strategic synergy and pragmatic cooperation. However, India's global rise will continue to demand a careful balancing act, engaging constructively with both sides of the American political aisle. Thank you for listening to me patiently.